The crate arrived on a gray morning, its wood damp from the mist that clung to the streets. No note, no address. The old shopkeeper dragged it inside, muttering curses under his breath. Business had been slow, the candy shop hanging by a thread. Maybe this was some promotional miracle, or a mistake. The crate groaned as it opened, nails straining against the wood. Inside sat a vending machine, like nothing he'd ever seen. Mechanical and polished to a gleam, it had a presence that felt wrong. The glass dome at the top revealed rows of perfectly round candies, their colors so vibrant they seemed to glow. He tilted the machine slightly, spotting words engraved on the underside. "Try something different today, sweet and candy red." He snorted and shook his head. "Wretch this stuff." Still, desperate times. He dusted off a corner near the front window and set the machine there. Its coin slot caught the light, winking at him like it knew something he didn't. The old man stared at it for a moment before fishing a coin from his pocket. One little test couldn't hurt. The coin clinked as it slid in. He pulled the lever, and the machine whirred mechanically, spitting out a single candy into the tray below. It was perfect, round, red, and faintly glistening. He rolled it in his palm before popping it into his mouth. The flavor hit him like a revelation. Sweetness bloomed on his tongue, bright and irresistible. It was like every childhood memory condensed into one perfect bite. For a moment, he forgot the world, forgot the bills, forgot the empty streets outside. Then, it turned. The sweetness soured, twisting into something sharp and metallic. His tongue burned, his throat tightening as if a fist had gripped it. His vision blurred, the shop tilting wildly around him. A pressure built in his chest, and his heart thudded like it was trying to escape. The whispers came next, soft at first, then getting louder. They skittered around his mind. His hands trembled, and he clawed at his shirt as though it might stop the suffocating weight pressing down on him. Then came the blood. At first, he dismissed the dampness under his arms, thinking it was sweat from the panic gripping him. But when he pulled his trembling hand away from his shirt, it was slick and red. His heart stopped, or at least it felt like it, as he looked down. Crimson stains seeped through his sleeves, pooling in the folds of his armpits. The sticky wetness spread to his toes, soaking his socks and dripping onto the wooden floor. "No," he whispered, his voice shaky. "No, no, no." The old man stumbled toward the mirror behind the counter, catching his reflection. Bloodshot eyes stared back at him, veins bulging and red tears streaming down his face. A faint trail of red trickled from his nose, dripping onto the counter. The sight twisted his stomach, and he nearly collapsed as the whispers in his head grew louder. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. He tried to wipe the blood away, but it only smeared, leaving crimson streaks on his pale skin. His trembling legs gave out, and he fell behind the counter, the whispers rising to a deafening roar in his ears. He stumbled backward, crashing into the shelves behind the counter. Glass jars rattled and fell, the sound barely registering. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air as the whispers rose to a crescendo. Cold sweat dripped down his back, pooling around him as his body shook uncontrollably. The machine stood silent, its polished surface reflecting the shopkeeper's pale, horrified face. Hours passed before the shopkeeper stirred. He sat up slowly, his breath shallow and uneven. Every inch of him screamed with exhaustion, his heart racing as though it might burst. His throat was raw, and every breath felt like swallowing shards of glass. The blood had dried, crusting over his skin and clothes. The whispers had faded, but they still echoed faintly in the corners of his mind. He staggered to his feet, gripping the counter for support. His eyes darted to the candy machine in the corner, its polished surface gleaming in the dim light. The lever glinted, innocent and inviting, as if mocking him. A sudden surge of anger jolted him into action. He grabbed a large garbage bag from behind the counter, the crinkle of the plastic loud in the stillness of the shop. With trembling hands, he approached the machine. His fingers hesitated on the glass dome containing the candies, but the whispers that had haunted him surged in his mind, spurring him forward. He yanked the dome off with a sharp pull, the glass cool and unnervingly smooth under his fingers. It felt heavier than he'd expected, Or maybe that was just the weight of the fear gnawing at him. One by one, the gumballs tumbled into the bag, their faintly shimmering surfaces catching the light as they fell in an almost hypnotic cascade. The shopkeeper tightened the bag with a savage twist, tying it shut with a knot that his shaking hands barely managed. He marched to the alley behind the shop, each step driven by a mixture of determination and dread. The garbage bin stood there, rusting and leaning slightly to one side, its lid askew. He threw the bag inside with more force than necessary, the gumballs rattling against the metal like sinister marbles. Slamming the lid shut, he lingered for a moment, his breath coming in uneven gasps. The whispers in his mind seemed fainter now, but they weren't gone. Back inside the shop, his gaze drifted back to the machine. A wrench sat on the counter nearby, and for a moment, the temptation to destroy the machine entirely burned hot in his chest. He grabbed the wrench, its weight familiar and reassuring in his grip. But then he stopped. His knuckles turned white as he stared at the machine, its presence almost daring him to make the first move. What if destroying it made things worse? What if the whispers came back stronger, angrier? The shopkeeper set the wrench down, his hands shaking. "Not yet," he whispered to himself, backing away. The machine remained, gleaming silently, patient as ever. He scrubbed at his arms, smearing dried blood into his sleeves. He could still feel the whispers slithering through his thoughts. Panic started to grip at him. That night, he bolted the shop door and hid in the back room, far from the machine's gleaming temptation. But the next morning, when he mustered the courage to unlock the shop and face the world, his heart sank. The machine was full again, its candy stock replenished as though nothing had happened. The polished surface seemed brighter, its engraving, "Try something different today, sweet and candy red," catching the light with unnerving cheer. The shopkeeper backed away. He swore he heard faint whispers as he fled to the back room. The shopkeeper's mind unraveled day by day. He barely left the back room, haunted by panic attacks and phantom voices. His wife found him pacing, muttering under his breath, or staring blankly at the wall. "You're scaring the customers," she snapped, shoving an order book into his hands. "Stay here if you're going to be useless." She dismissed his warnings as nonsense. Overwork, she told herself. A man his age running a shop without help was bound to take a toll. To her, the machine was a blessing. Customers were curious, drawn to its sleek design and the novelty of its candies. Sales were up, and she had no intention of getting rid of it. One sunny afternoon, a young boy walked into the shop with his mother. He barely noticed the jars of licorice or the rows of sugar sticks. His attention locked onto the vending machine. His small hands clenched his mother's skirt, his voice rising in excitement. "I want that one," he said, pointing at the machine. His mother frowned. "You have plenty of candy at home." "But I don't have that one," the boy whined, tugging harder. His voice grew louder with every protest, drawing glances from other customers. The mother sighed, digging into her purse for a coin. "Fine," she said, her tone weary. She dropped the coin into his eager palm. "But you're not eating it until after dinner, understand?" The boy nodded, already bounding toward the machine. The coin clinked into the slot, and he pulled the lever with all his might. A single candy dropped into the dispenser. He plucked it out, holding it up like a prize. The candy shimmered faintly, its surface glossy and vibrant, almost too perfect. "Thank you, Mommy," he chirped, clutching it tightly as they left the shop. The shopkeeper's wife watched them go, shaking her head. "Kids and their sweets," she muttered, turning back to the counter. She didn't notice the faint hum that lingered in the air, nor the way the machine's lever reset itself, ready for the next customer. That evening, the boy bolted through his dinner, his fork clattering against the plate as he devoured the meal with all the grace of a starved animal. "Can I have it now?" he asked, mouth still half full. His mother sighed, exchanging a glance with his father before nodding. "Go ahead," she said, "but brush your teeth after." The boy didn't wait for further permission. He sprinted to his room, slamming the door behind him. Perched on his bed, he pulled the candy from his pocket. The wrapper crinkled as he took it off, the sound sharp and electric in the quiet room. He held the candy up, turning it in his fingers, marveling at the faint shimmer. With a triumphant grin, he popped it into his mouth. The sweetness hit him like a tidal wave, a syrupy explosion of flavor that made his eyes water. He murmured, savoring it. But then, it changed. The sweetness soured, turning sharp and metallic. A bitterness clawed at the back of his throat, and his stomach churned. Suddenly, a jolt of pain shot through him like an electric shock. His fingers twitched uncontrollably, dropping the candy wrapper onto the floor. Then, the whispers began. They were faint at first, a low murmur brushing the edges of his consciousness, but they grew louder, insistent, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. His hands shot to his ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was inside his head, crawling under his skin. "Stop!" he screamed, his voice high and cracked. "Make it stop!" The shadows in his room seemed to move. His toy cars, neatly lined up on the shelf, rattled as if an unseen hand had brushed against them. His favorite stuffed bear toppled from the bed, its button eyes glinting eerily in the dim light. He scrambled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was nowhere to go. Blood pooled under his arms, seeping through his shirt and leaving dark stains on his pajama sleeves. The tips of his socks grew red and damp, sticky with a crimson sheen that spread to the carpet. A sharp sting burned at the corner of his eyes. He wiped at them, but his hand came away smeared with red. "Mom!" he shrieked, but the words were barely coherent. He doubled over, his stomach twisting. Blood dripped from his nose, splattering onto the candy wrapper as his body convulsed. His skin glistened with sweat, streaked with faint trails of crimson. The door burst open, and his parents rushed in. His mother froze in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God!" she gasped. His father darted forward, grabbing the boy's trembling shoulders. "What's happening to him?" he yelled, his voice rising with panic. The boy clawed at his father's arms, his wide eyes darting around the room, as though he were seeing something they couldn't. "It's here!" he choked out, his voice raw. "It's here!" The candy wrapper lay discarded on the floor, the faint, sweet smell lingering in the air. The mother picked it up with trembling fingers, staring at it as if it held the answer. But the glossy paper offered no clues, only the lingering promise of something sweet and candy red. The boy's cries echoed through the neighborhood that night, his parents' shouts barely masking the chaos. By morning, everyone had heard the story, or some version of it. Whispers swirled in the corners of the diner and at the general store. "Did you hear about that boy?" someone would ask, leaning in as if the details might vanish if spoken too loudly. "Blood everywhere, they say. And the candy from that machine," another neighbor would add, hushed but eager. The candy shop itself seemed to hold its breath. Fewer parents dared to enter, casting wary glances at the vending machine through the window. But their children, wide-eyed and curious, couldn't resist pressing their noses to the glass. It didn't take long for the machine to claim another child. This time, it was a shy girl with pigtails, her cheeks flushed as she clutched a few coins in her tiny hand. She'd saved every penny of her allowance, eyeing the forbidden candy with growing curiosity each time she passed the shop. Today, her chance had come. Her mother lingered in the bookstore next door, engrossed in a discussion about the latest novel. The girl seized the moment, slipping into the shop as quietly as a shadow. The shopkeeper's wife sat at the counter, poring over a stack of receipts. She barely looked up as the girl approached the vending machine. The girl hesitated, her heart pounding as she slid the coin into the slot. The lever felt cold in her small hand. She pulled it, her breath catching as the candy tumbled into the dispenser. She picked it up, gazing at its shimmering surface. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint hum, but she brushed it off and darted out of the shop, her prize clutched tightly. That night, her parents found her curled under her bed. Her hands and feet were crusted with dried blood, the metallic smell filling the room. At first, they thought she'd hurt herself, but a frantic inspection revealed no injuries, just the grotesque patterns of her own sweat pooling and drying in thick, crimson streaks. "Sweetheart," her mother whispered, kneeling to meet her daughter's hollow stare. "What happened?" The girl didn't answer. Her lips moved, but the words were nonsense. Broken phrases and murmurs that made no sense. Tears streamed from her bloodshot eyes, staining her cheeks red. Her parents exchanged terrified glances, their child trembling and unresponsive in their arms. The town's unease deepened when the next incident followed just days later. A boy, known for his boldness and love of adventure, used his pocket money to buy the candy. He was last seen stuffing it into his mouth as he walked toward the woods, a wide grin on his face. Hours passed before his family found him, barefoot and wandering aimlessly through the trees. His clothes were torn, his skin streaked with dirt and blood. His face was pale, his expression blank.
"Son, what happened to you?"
his father asked, gripping the boy's shoulders, his voice shaking. The boy blinked, his eyes unfocused. His lips quivered as he whispered,
"I don't know."
His father's grip tightened.
"What do you mean you don't know? Where have you been?"
The boy looked down at his hands, coated in blood. He held them up, trembling.
"Who am I?"
he asked softly. His parents stepped back in horror. The boy didn't seem to recognize them, or himself. There were no injuries, no explanation for the blood, only silence, broken by the boy's ragged breathing and his mother's sobs. The shop became a cursed place. Parents yanked their children away from the windows, their warnings growing sharper.
"Stay away from there. Do you hear me?"
A chorus of "Yes, ma'am," and "Yes, sir," followed, but the children's eyes still darted toward the machine, their curiosity gnawing at them. The shopkeeper's wife was no fool. She noticed the dwindling foot traffic and the fearful glances.
"It's just a machine,"
she muttered one evening, sweeping the floor. But that's when the shopkeeper's wife remembered something strange. No matter how many candies the machine dispensed, by morning, its glass dome was full again. At first, she chalked it up to a trick of the mind. Perhaps she hadn't been paying attention. But that same night, after locking up, she emptied the dome herself, pouring every last gumball into a tin bucket. She carried the bucket to the back room, stuffing it into a cupboard and locking the door for good measure. The next morning, the dome was full again. She froze, staring at the machine as a chill crept up her spine. The polished surface seemed to shimmer under the dim shop lights, the coin slot almost beckoning at her. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly, but she pulled back at the last second.
"Just my imagination,"
she whispered, trying to steady her breath. But deep down, she knew better. That night, she left the shop lights on. Meanwhile, the rumors reached further than the town, carried by concerned whispers and unsettling reports. Parents spoke of children drenched in blood that wasn't theirs, of panic attacks and hallucinations. The stories of missing children and bizarre deaths eventually caught the attention of the SCP Foundation. One crisp morning, two men in dark suits entered the shop. Their voices were calm, their questions pointed. They introduced themselves as government officials conducting a safety inspection.
"We've heard reports of strange occurrences linked to this machine,"
one said, his eyes fixed on the vending contraption. The shopkeeper's wife hesitated.
"It's just a candy machine,"
she said weakly, but her voice faltered. The whispers had kept her awake for nights, and the memory of the refilled dome haunted her. The men exchanged a glance.
"We'd like to take it for further examination," the other said, "for public safety."
Relief and dread warred within her.
"Take it,"
she said quickly, almost too eagerly. The Foundation agents moved with precision. A containment team arrived within the hour, disassembling the machine piece by piece. Despite its mechanical simplicity, the process was far from ordinary. The polished exterior resisted their tools, the lever locked stubbornly in place until they used specialized equipment to disable it. As the machine was packed into a reinforced crate, one agent held up the base, revealing the inscription. "Try something different today, sweet and candy red." The phrase dripped with irony, given the chaos it had caused. The shopkeeper and his wife were escorted into a back room. Their memories of the machine, the candy, and the horrors it had unleashed were erased with a simple injection. They would wake the next morning with only a faint sense of something missing. The machine was transported to a secure Foundation site, its mysteries far from solved. Researchers marveled at its infinite supply of candy, its indestructible mechanisms, and the faint hum it emitted in the quiet of the observation chamber.
"Where did it come from?"
one researcher mused aloud, staring at the refilled dome. No one answered. The machine sat silent, its polished surface reflecting the sterile lights of the containment room. For now, it was contained. But as the whispers began to creep through the facility's halls, one thing became clear. This anomaly, now formally designated SCP-942, was far from finished. The machine, now officially labeled SCP-942-2, was wheeled into a reinforced chamber under the watchful eyes of armed guards and nervous researchers. It sat in the center of the brightly lit room, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. For weeks it remained still, silent, and yet undeniably ominous. Researchers set up constant surveillance. Cameras captured every angle of the machine, but it offered no answers. The dome refilled itself each night with the same crimson-tinted candies. There was no observable mechanism, no hidden compartment. The candies simply appeared. One researcher stared at the monitor, their voice tinged with unease.
It's like it's taunting us.
Another shrugged, trying to mask their own nerves.
Or just showing off.
The candies, now designated SCP-942-1, were subjected to rigorous analysis. Their composition seemed ordinary at first: sugar, artificial flavoring, food dye, but their effects on living subjects told a much darker story. D-Class personnel were brought in for testing. Each was handed a single candy, instructed to consume it, and monitored closely. The first subject popped it into their mouth, chewing slowly. At first, their expression brightened.
Tastes amazing,
they murmured, a faint smile tugging at their lips. But within moments, their demeanor shifted. Their hands trembled, their breathing quickened. They clutched their head, muttering incoherently. Then, the screaming began.
Get them out!
The researcher barked, but it was too late. The subject collapsed, convulsing violently before falling into unconsciousness. The pattern was clear. SCP-942-1 wasn't just candy. It was a weapon, disguised as a treat. Despite strict protocols, curiosity proved to be a dangerous weakness. During a routine experiment, one researcher, fatigued and frustrated, decided to taste SCP-942-1 themselves. Whether it was a lapse in judgment or an act of defiance, the result was the same. The moment they bit into the candy, their eyes widened. At first, they seemed fine. Then they weren't. Their breathing turned erratic. They clawed at their arms, leaving deep red streaks as they screamed about shadows moving in the corners of the room. They stumbled into equipment, their voice rising in hysteria.
They're watching! They're everywhere!
They shrieked before collapsing onto the floor, twitching and muttering incoherently. The incident left the observation team shaken.
That's why we have protocols,
the lead researcher said coldly, though their voice betrayed a hint of fear. The researcher was sedated and taken for observation. Their prognosis was grim. Weeks turned into months, but the Foundation's brightest minds were no closer to understanding SCP-942-2. The machine's ability to replenish candy remained a mystery. It defied every attempt to probe its inner workings. X-rays showed nothing unusual. Attempts to dismantle it were met with failure, as tools shattered against its metal frame. SCP-942-2 remains contained in its reinforced chamber, monitored day and night. The candies are carefully cataloged, each piece treated as a potential threat. Researchers continue their experiments, but the anomaly remains an enigma. For now, SCP-942-2 sits silently, its polished surface reflecting the sterile glow of the lab. The candies inside gleam invitingly, their crimson hues promising sweetness and something far more sinister. Whatever its purpose, one thing is certain. This machine, with its endless supply of SCP-942-1, is determined to make dentists and therapists rich.